So I'd first of all like to thank you all for really interesting and incisive comments. So I'll start with a question about, about how do you conceptualize state capacity. And the one thing I wanted to say is that I just kind of, in a way plucked out two dimensions, and I think Lily's done a great job of putting them in context. But I think the interesting thing which Devesh's presentation and my presentation together kind of bring out is that India does much better in certain, not much better to China, but in a kind of relative to India itself, in certain dimensions of state capacity. So for instance, Devesh mentioned, which is really not a trivial thing at all, which is the conduct of elections, of free and fair elections, and the organization of the census every 10 years. This is a stupendous achievement, and India does do it. And yet, on almost every indicator of public goods provision, whether it's education or health or toilets, which is something I'm also very interested in, but have never really been bold enough to present. But I think, I can talk a little bit more about why I think almost every Indian, I think, has been kind of very concerned about this question. At least every Indian scholar does at some point in time in their scholarly thinking, the focus on toilets. So the point is that, it's not, so the Indians, so I think when you think about state capacity, and which is something that I have to say I did not bring out in my presentation, is that it's not that the Indian state is uniformly weak, and it's not that it is uniformly unable to implement. It does implement its policies, for instance, as regards the conduct of elections and the census, and yet it fails miserably. And so then the question becomes, is it one of intention? Is it one of implementation? And I think Devesh's presentation brought that out really nicely. The second point is, of course, Professor Dwara has done a much better job of really presenting what I wanted to say. It's much more articulate, and I think it's absolutely right. I agree with everything you've said, and it's kind of set me thinking. It is this idea of the sense that the state is out there, which is why, in response to Min's point about, that the identification with the state has increased in the past 5 years, I've been struggling to kind of think about whether what I'm talking about is nationalism, and I'm not actually certain that it is. I actually think it's not. It's something a little different, and I really haven't been able to kind of think through what that is. But I think that, so this idea that it's not, so, if nationalism is increased in the last 5 years, that well may be the case and might be related to a lot of factors, but it's the fact that, this idea that the state is out there predates, as I said, kind of goes back in time historically, and I don't think it's nationalism, but I can't exactly tell you what it is at this point. The third point, very quickly, about political parties, and I did not talk about that, but I think this goes back to Daniel Koss's, I think, good point about the fact that why is it that Indian parties are not able to penetrate? And I think it's yet another instance of what Professor Dwara called this low state effect. And I think it kind of goes back to this idea that the state is, and of course, we have to think about the relationship between parties as institutions and state capacity. But the fact that Indian political parties have not been able to penetrate the countryside, that even the Congress relies heavily on local notables. And I think Professor Dwara nicely mentioned, it's this progressive head with a very conservative body. But I think that that's another way in which this kind of low stateness or low state effect has manifested itself. And finally, this question of people not reporting robberies initially I thought about the China-India comparison quite differently, but Jen Pan, who is a graduate student here at the government department and was here for the previous session, so with her, I had been looking at existing survey data in India and China and trying to kind of see, very much along the lines of what Lily was suggesting, but obviously she's done much more work on this, is, how do people kind of conceptualize public participation? And the interesting thing is the figures for China and India from, national election surveys, the Asian Barometer, look strikingly similar. So the proportion of people who have trust in government, trust in key local institutions, whether they think that the state is run by big interests or whether it listens to them. It's unbelievable how controlling for rural-urban, level of education, level of income, India and China in those respects, in terms of state societal perceptions of the state, actually look remarkably similar. And there are obviously huge problems in using survey data, which not all of us are Lily who can do this unbelievable survey exercise. But it is interesting that there are many similarities in popular perceptions of the state.
I think one point which relates also to the previous panel, the point that Yashang and Tarun had made, or this idea of, does democracy versus a single party government, does it matter? I think in one respect, I think a comparison here, it does matter. which is that fundamentally, because India is a democracy, the legitimacy is much more process-based. Whereas in China, they have to pay much more attention to performance as a basis of some legitimacy. So in some ways, you could argue that the very fact that the politicians in India believe they have a degree of sort of legitimacy, they don't believe they have to work as hard, in a sense. What the hell, you have that. Yeah, so I have that legitimacy. I don't have to prove myself, in a sense, through certain outcomes. And I think I do think that's a part of this where this does matter. If you look at surveys of the public about Indian politicians, and this is not unique to India, you look at the US, you look now in Europe, politicians in democracies rank with prostitutes in the sort of ranking of, how high.
Integrity.
Yeah. But at the same time, when the public is asked about the legitimacy of the system, of the state, that it continues to enjoy a very high legitimacy. So there's a paradox between how they look at the system at large as opposed to politicians or bureaucrats, when you ask them to identify specifics. And, again, police always rank very low. I mean, when I first showed this data about the decline in crime and the police vacancies, someone said, well, that's what explains it. The police are thugs, there are fewer thugs, so you have less crime. So it completely turns it the other way around. Now, I think the thing about national capacity, I'm not sure if you meant it as identical to state capacity, but I do think that we should think of it as distinctive from state capacity. In a sense, I mean, in my own work, I've been thinking about how, national capacity, now that you have large private sectors in all countries, surely must incorporate the private sector's capabilities, right? You cannot, divorce it. And much of what the state itself does, it needs the private sector to do. I mean, the actual actions. And I think the larger question is, when you look at national capacity and you think of its components in some loose sense are not only the capacity of the state, but of the private sector, but also of civil society. Under what conditions are they complementary or substitutes, right? When do they undermine each other, and when do they work for a common goal? And at least I don't have that answer. But I think, to me, that's the sort of way one should begin to ask that question. Under what conditions does this happen, and when it doesn't, as a contingent sort of historical question.
Yes, Yasham?
I don't know if there are survey data that has the comparable Chinese population and comparable Indian population. I don't know if there are surveys that has comparable set of Chinese population, comparable set of Indian population, what their expectations of the state are, right? So accountability, to some extent, is expectation. If you don't expect the government to provide basic education, to provide public health, of course you don't hold them accountable for failing to do that, right? So it would be interesting if we get some data on different Chinese and Indian attitudes about that. And in China, the assumption is that the government needs to do not just public education, public health, but all these other things, right? So the expectations are very broad, very sweeping. I want to ask, Devish, are there very different Indian expectations, and are there data?
Unfortunately, Indian expectations are rather low. So in some ways, you could argue that I'm being facetious here. I mean, I think what's something that is, different, and here it goes to, I think, Liz's early question about society. I think the general sense is that the way democratic politics played itself out in India in the first half century was about the politics of like dignity, right? So it was more about intergroup, hierarchies being, in a sense, flattened, right? Because of the pernicious legacy of the caste system, right? There is now a sense, especially with more recent elections, that battle, if it hasn't been won, it's less salient now than it used to be, and therefore the public and voters are demanding more of the state and politicians to deliver the sort of public goods which, in a traditional story of democracy, is sort of what you would expect. So the idea there is that voters had different priorities, because most voters were poor and therefore they were from historically socially marginalized groups. They had different priorities, which was about the politics of dignity rather than the material goods that we think they ought to have. But that has sort of been working itself out, and now the voters' attention has been shifting to performance in the way that has happened in the case of China.
But Divisha, I guess we need to distinguish between expectations of the performance and the expectations of the role of the state, right? So you may have very low expectations about the performance.
Right.
Nevertheless, you think this is something that is the responsibility of the government.
Right.
Right. So I'm not clear about which kind of expectations that you are talking about. Is it? It sounds more like a performance. I have very low expectations of the state performance.
Yeah,
so,
but can I respond to that? So,
Yeah.
in surveys, so India's had a tradition of national election surveys beginning in 1996, and in that they regularly ask questions about, do you think it is the responsibility of the state to provide? And they have a series of things, for instance, housing, health, education. And in that, I think that Devish is absolutely right, because there are also questions about expectations about the performance of the state, which is that, do you think if you visit, if you go to a government office, what are the chances that your query will be dealt with? And those are very low, but the expectations of what the state should be doing in terms, for instance, of providing services like roads or health centers or schools are actually quite high. And I don't know what the kind of relative figures for China would be, but in India from 1996 to the latest survey in 2009, those expectations of what role the state should be playing are actually quite high.
And how important would you say these kinds of surveys are as a mechanism for the state to get information and to figure out about policies? Lily raised the important question of what role are these riots playing in China? Is it really pressuring the state, or is it providing information to the state? Because obviously, if you're willing to go out there and engage in risky behavior, you must care a lot about something or other, and that's very important information for the state to know whether or not it really feels pressured about it. It knows that that's some kind of grievance and concern that maybe it would want to take seriously in some way or another.